Okay, thank you. Very interesting panel. And I want to ask to Barbara, you talk about the debt crisis in Europe. How many time we have until the bubble will explode?
Well, I already explained that Austrian economics does not predict the future, and we are humble people, and we are sometimes wrong as well. But we have already bought time once, twice, 3 times by bailing out various countries, by setting up all these mechanisms, whether it was the EFSF, the ESM, and now the ESM and the banking union. So as long as politicians will follow these policies, this will go on, and eventually this house of cards will fall apart. What we have created is a bubble of sovereign nation debt, and this will, as we all know, burst sooner or later. But I cannot predict. I have to admit, I was actually thinking that Greece should go bust, and that they should leave the euro. I said this 2 years ago, and they all kind of said, go away with it. I underestimated the politicians' will to stay in power and their greed for power, and also the banksters, which are the best lobbyists in Brussels. And we have to take this as a fact. Unfortunately, I wish it were over tomorrow. It would be hard for everybody, but eventually, with structural reforms, we would be on the right path. If Greece had gone bust 2.5 years ago, they would have solved their problems by now. But what the bailouts meant, they didn't go to the individuals, to the people. They only saved, excuse my language now, the asses of the politicians and the banks. Full stop, and that's it. And until people do not understand this, we will go on with these bubbles, unfortunately.
Let me add something to that. The reason it's hard to predict is because nobody would have thought that the European Central Bank would basically sacrifice its independence and become a purchasing agent for dodgy government debt throughout Europe. But at some point, it can't go on forever. And not only do you still have an absence of the kind of structural reform needed, not only in Greece but also in Spain and Portugal, Italy, other countries, but it's going to spread. I think the next shoes to drop will be France and Belgium. Yeah. Now again, Draghi has said at the ECB he'll do whatever it takes. So theoretically, if you own your own printing press, you can buy up all the debt you would ever possibly want, and that's sort of going to postpone the day of reckoning. But when that time runs out, when the bubble finally bursts, then it will become even more severe. And if you look at the data, the long-run data, by long run, we're only talking 10, 20 years, by the way, the long-run data from the European Commission, from the IMF, from the OECD, from the Bank for International Settlements, the projections for debt accumulation in Europe are absolutely scary. And by the way, the U.S. isn't that far behind, so we're in the same mess. So I worry the ECB is simply postponing and making worse the eventual mess. And when it happens, it's going to be very ugly. And I really worry about a lot of social chaos and disarray, and even potentially the loss of democracy in some countries.
May I add? What is happening right now with the SSM is that, again, they are buying time, that banks are cleaning up their balance sheets, that they get rid of all the ugly assets, and in the end, eventually the taxpayer will fail. They tried first in Cyprus. They failed last time. But the next time, when Cyprus was a test that they were running, obviously, first time it didn't work out. But trust me, eventually, once the banks have cleaned up their balance sheets with their dirty bonds, they will try it again.
May I add one point to this, and that is central bankers usually assume that we'll have plenty of time to react if things start to go bad. That is not the case. The system is complex, it is nonlinear, and we cannot predict when there will be a catastrophic collapse, and we do not know at this moment how close or far away we are from a catastrophic collapse. It's akin to adding weight to the branch of a tree. You can add weight, another pound, nothing happens until it breaks. It is that kind of nonlinear, complex system.
Next question?
Well, I would like to know if you have any thought about fragmentation in Spain in the hypothetical case that Catalonia secedes, if you have any thought about this.
Who are you addressing the question to? To all of us?
Yes.
Okay.
I think one of the best models in the world for how a country is governed is Switzerland. And one of the reasons it's a good role model is not only do they have this thing called a debt brake, which is really a spending cap, and in my mind, the most important fiscal variable is not deficits and debt, it's the government spending. The deficits and debt are just a symptom. The government spending is the disease, and Switzerland's spending cap has been very successful in keeping them out of trouble. But to specifically answer your question, what makes Switzerland so attractive is that there is genuine decentralization. It's not like the Australian states or the lenders in Germany where you have a federal structure, but everything is governed out of Berlin or out of Canberra. In Switzerland, the cantons and the municipal governments raise their own money and spend their own money. And I'm not an expert on Spain, but my understanding is you have a lot of cross distribution between provinces, and you have you don't have the responsibility of raising and spending your own money in the way that you have in Switzerland. And so it's not my job to say whether there should be an independent Basque region or Catalonia. I don't even know how to spell some of these things. I'm an American. But I do know from America's history where we did have the right kind of federalism for a long time, we've lost that a lot. Switzerland still has a good bit of it. That role model works very well. So maybe keep Spain together, but radically decentralized so there's more competition between the regions. The local people get to choose what type of government and how much government they have and how they want to finance it. I think that is a very, very good role model. And whether you do it as independent countries or whether you do it as a loose confederation like Switzerland, I think that's just, people get along better in that kind of system. You know, there's a saying in the U.S., good fences make good neighbors. Well, decentralization is just a way of applying that in a logical fashion.
I'd like to reinforce that if I could. It's healthy if states have the ability to secede because it represents competition to the original state. And if the individual states have the freedom of choice to remain part of the larger union or to leave it, that forces the larger union to perform. Let me give you two examples. Canada has weathered the recent financial crisis generally better than the United States has. And speaking more broadly, over the last decade or two, has exhibited greater financial discipline than the United States. Over the last several decades, Quebec and other provinces in Canada have been able to make a credible case for secession. That has forced the Canadian government to devolve more responsibility to the individual provinces and generally to perform better. It's because if they don't, they may lose one or more of those provinces. That's a healthy thing. It's regrettable, in my view, that none of the states except possibly Texas in the United States have the right to secede. It would be a very healthy dynamic for the United States. Second example, look at Czechoslovakia. So when they split originally, it was clearly beneficial to the Czech Republic, and it was somewhat of a disadvantage initially for Slovakia. My general sense, and I defer to those of you in the room who know more than I do, is that it's been a good thing even for Slovakia in recent years. So, of course, there's more accountability when you have smaller governmental groups.
Being a Tyrolean, I would like to add up in this because we Tyroleans are known to have been independent always and have not paid our taxes and dues to the emperor in Austria. So we were always on the positive side and were very much self-determined until we became part of the Republic of Austria, the free. Dan has already covered the topic of direct democracy and tax autonomy and competition, which is most important. The competitive, we must not underestimate competition. Also for regions, but also for smaller political units. We, however, have a problem in Europe. There are only 2 countries in Europe that allow provinces or states to go bust. And this is Hungary and Estonia. Else, it's everywhere in all European or in national constitutions, it's prohibited. So once you succeed or separate, this is one issue that needs to be solved, as Jose already pointed out earlier with the pension system. This is something. And also, but we do have a couple of positive examples, like in South Tyrol, where they have a huge rate of autonomy. And this is something as a first part that could start to get regions also to cooperate. And we see this in alpine regions or in the regions of the Danube region or in regions at the northern part of Germany where they cover various nation states, but the regions, the European regions cooperate. So it's a question of geography, probably more and it's becoming more and more a question of geography and diversity and the historic fragmentation that we have seen in the past. So maybe this pendulum that we now see, a very strong Brussels and this federal Europe, swings back to this direction of cooperation within and competition, both cooperation and competition within those regions. So this is hopefully the first step towards separation of some parts.
Hello, I have a question to Mr. Dan Mitchell. Comment regarding tax competition, generally speaking. The idea is great. It always worked in the small states and the bigger states between countries, continents, and everything. But when a government or like here in the European Union eventually becomes so powerful, military, that it can bully anyone to comply, where does the place to go? The government will acquire enough power to know everything about you, whatever you do, where you live, whatever you do. And it can bully people, and eventually it will bully corporations, it will bully countries, and it will just control everything, and there'll be no place to go. What then?
Well, unfortunately, you're describing the United States government, because one of our recent legislative initiatives that I'm particularly ashamed of is FATCA. And FATCA basically tells banks in other countries, if you do anything that touches on anything involving the United States, you are required at the paying of a 30% withholding tax to, in effect, become an agency of the IRS. That, to me, is not only a horrible tax law, because it's all about enforcing double taxation on an extraterritorial basis, but is one of the most odious examples of financial imperialism. I mean, we have a worse worldwide tax system than the French have ever dreamed about having. And if you're taxing worse than the French, you're really, really doing something wrong. And we're doing it. And because we are that 800-pound gorilla in the world economy, it's very, very unfortunate that a lot of the low-tax jurisdictions around the world have been forced to knuckle under and surrender to the United States, even though, and this is where the hypocrisy is really astounding, and I write about this on my blog all the time because I won't be able to get into too much detail, but the U.S. is actually a tax haven itself if you're a foreigner. Technically a non-resident alien. If you're a foreigner living in the U.S., you're still swept into the IRS. But if you're a foreigner, things like Delaware and Nevada and Alaska corporations are some of the best tax planning vehicles in the world. If you're a foreigner, you can invest and get capital gains and interest income in the U.S. and not have it reported to the IRS, and therefore there's nothing for the IRS to send your home country. So we, in effect, go out and tell other countries, you have to become deputy tax collectors for us, but in the meantime, and to our credit, I'm glad we're a tax haven, we're attracting trillions of dollars from overseas, in part because of that, but shouldn't just simple ethics and honesty require us to have a level playing field and let countries stop taxing at the border? If there's a law against gambling in one U.S. state, like say Virginia, no casinos in Virginia, but if I go to Nevada, to Las Vegas to gamble, does Virginia have the right to say, you were gambling in Nevada, therefore we're going to arrest you when you come back home? No, of course not. But that's in effect what international taxation is becoming with the anti-tax competition efforts of the U.S. government, the OECD, the European Union Savings Tax Directive, same principle. Double tax on an extraterritorial basis, fundamentally bad tax policy. It's the empire of big government striking back, to use the Star Wars phrase. The empire striking back against the liberalizing effect of tax competition, and it's one of the reasons I'm very worried about the future of the Western world.
I think that's all the time we have. Help me thank the panel, and we'll take a short break.